Hey, you guys. Today are my introductory comments about Charlie Chaplin and the 1936 film Modern Times. The first thing that I recommend is go and watch. I recommended a short 4-minute biographical video, actually from Biography, the Biography channel, listed in sort of the required materials, although it's put as recommended. And if you want kind of some basic biographical information about Chaplin and his background and sort of his career, it gives a great overview, and it's only 4 minutes long. So go ahead and watch that first and then come back to this video. So Charlie Chaplin is perhaps one of the greatest comedic actors of the 20th century, and his character of the Tramp, or the Little Tramp, is one of the most iconic figures in American and global cinema. Debuting in 1915, the Tramp quickly became one of the most memorable figures of the silent film era, and the Tramp is often seen as a figure of social commentary, demonstrating the contradictions inherent in industrialization, class conflict, and ideas such as the American dream. In your assigned reading for this week, sort of the British Film Institute's first book, the first two chapters of their book about Modern Times, the author Mellon says on page 21, quote, "No 20th century artist was to reveal more sympathy for the poor and the outcast. For the working man, Chaplin offered not pity for the little fellow, but admiration for this ordinary man, with his endless capacity to survive, for his energy, fortitude, integrity, generosity, and humanity. The little fellow remains a person without malice, no matter the abuse inflicted upon him by bullies, the rich in their hired hands, the police. Each of the Chaplin films with the little fellow at its center concludes in a spiritual victory." So the Tramp, or the Little Fellow, is a character that is primarily associated with the silent era. But with the advent of sound cinema in the late 1920s, Chaplin initially refuses to make a talkie. He didn't want the Tramp to speak. So instead, in the 1930s, Chaplin made two films where sound is integrated into the film, but the Tramp and most of the other characters speak no dialogue. The first of these is 1931's City Lights, and then the second is today's film Modern Times from 1936. So in Modern Times, Chaplin is continuing to rely on physical movement, facial expressions, and other traditions of pantomime and silent comedy. But the Tramp becomes a representation of the struggles of individuals during the Great Depression. And Chaplin actually officially retires the character of the Tramp after Modern Times. So this is the last film that Chaplin appears in as this character. However, Chaplin's next film, 1940's The Great Dictator, uses a visually similar character in sort of the figure of both the barber and his doppelganger, a dictator, and it's a send-up of Hitler, basically. So while including dialogue and other standard conventions of sound films, many of the characteristics of Chaplin's previous work are found in his films in the sound era in the 30s and 40s. So physical comedy, pantomime, and social commentary. And all three of these films, City Lights, Modern Times, The Great Dictator, are often considered to be the apex of Chaplin's comedic and political genius. I think it's important to talk about sort of Chaplin's sort of business acumen and sort of his importance in kind of the business side of filmmaking. So Chaplin was actually one of the founders of the studio United Artists in 1919. It's founded by Charlie Chaplin, along with very well-known actors Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, as well as director D.W. Griffith. Griffith was a prolific and popular director at the time, but also, infamously known for the incredibly racist film Birth of a Nation. So United Artists was an independent studio. This is kind of the birth of independent cinema, where artists, this would be actors and directors, could have more direct control of their products. So Chaplin really founds United Artists as really a distribution system, that artists themselves would make their films without the control of a studio, which was very prominent during this era. And then United Artists would help distribute and promote them. United Artists actually exists in name today still. You can still see movies made under sort of the United Artists label, although it's been a part of MGM since the early 1980s. But the advent of United Artists in 1919 gave Chaplin almost complete control over his films and allowed him to address more politically charged themes than the other major studios would have allowed him to. So if he was working under another studio, they would have made him tone it down. So Chaplin wrote, directed, produced, edited, starred in, and even helped compose the music for many of his films in the 20s and 30s. So the sort of the inspiration for modern times was in the early 1930s, so kind of at the height of the Depression. Of course, didn't really affect Charlie Chaplin. He was a multimillionaire. But he embarks on a worldwide ocean voyage. And in the course of his trip, every stop on the globe that the ship made reflected evidence of the Great Depression. This isn't just something that happened in the United States or even the West. This was a global massive economic depression. So when he returned to the US, he started production on modern times. So the film is commentary not just on the Great Depression, but on the effects of industrialization, mechanization, unemployment, and even police violence on common people, albeit through comedy and laughter. So we can think of the political importance of comedy. In the 1940s, Chaplin's popularity in the US went into decline. And he was accused of leftist and communist sympathies. He also was embroiled in kind of this salacious headline-grabbing paternity suit, and he was the victim of an FBI smear campaign. J. Edgar Hoover did not like Chaplin very much. He actually refused to testify before a committee in the late 1940s. So in the late 1940s in the US, there was a lot of sort of anti-communist panic, and there was a huge sort of investigation of Hollywood that actually resulted in sort of, the blacklisting of some people who couldn't work. And Chaplin actually refused to testify. And he was, for all practical purposes, kind of unofficially blacklisted. So he left the US for Switzerland. And U.S. authorities revoked his reentry permit in 1952, as he was not a U.S. citizen. He held a British passport. And he did not return to the U.S. until 1972, when he was given an honorary Academy Award. And 5 years later, he died, of course, leaving one of the most prolific creative legacies, comedic legacies of, the past 150 years. So for the film Modern Times, there's a number of things that actually, before I say that, the Criterion Collection actually did a really interesting 15-minute kind of making of this film and background of the film. And so I'm actually going to put it on the course website. It's not required, but if you're interested, it's a really sort of fascinating discussion of how the film was made and his relationship with the female star, Paulette Goddard. Sorry, I forgot her name for a second. And then also about how a lot of the use of still photography during production was kind of important. So it's kind of a neat little mini documentary if you're interested. So the things that I want you to think about for the film. So how does the film use sound? So, the Tramp is a character of the silent era. And, we're in 1936, 7-8 years into the sound era. So think about how Chaplin is very consciously using sound as well as the conventions of silent film. Who speaks and who does not, and why? When and how is music used? When and how are sound effects used? And when are they not used? So think about what sound is doing. Also think about how Chaplin uses bodily movements in pantomime in the character of the Tramp in lieu of dialogue. I mean, this is definitely sort of acting style from the silent era, but he's still doing it quite effectively in 1936. Also think about how the film connects with audiences living through the Great Depression. What aspects of 1930s life are part of the film that we see? Unemployment, strikes, police brutality, starvation, Hoovervilles. And how does the film engage in social and political critique? So think about how specific scenes engage in critique and how. For example, how does the film portray and comment on specific issues such as factory work, industrialization, mechanization of the production process, on social inequalities and class differences, ideas about class mobility and the American dream, employment and unemployment, hunger and food politics, the police and incarceration, strikes and labor demonstration. There's a lot of political content here and a really funny movie. So that brings us to the next question, which is, what is the purpose of comedy and humor in the film? Are comedic scenes just for laughs or for a larger purpose? And does the film successfully strike this balance between entertainment and critique, right? That overarching theme of the class, right? Escapism versus social commentary. Also, think about how the character of the tramp is defined and developed over the course of the film, and what are his concerns and desires and dreams and wishes, and how is this characterization conveyed in the film? And why is the tramp generally received as such a sympathetic character? Why do we like him so much? Why do we sympathize with him so much? Why do we care about the tramp so much? The tramp is kind of a perennial outsider, outside of wealth, outside of mainstream society, but also at the same time representative of the common person. So think about how that is conveyed. Finally, think about how the character of the gamine, the female lead, Paulette Goddard, how she is defined and developed over the course of the film, and how she is sort of juxtaposed against the character of the tramp. Also think about the relationship between the tramp and the gamine. Does her character in this relationship conform or push against conventions of gender and sexuality of the time, or both? I mean, we can talk about maybe moments where she sort of is the object of the male gaze in kind of her physicality and her dress, but also in the text of the film, they're friends, not lovers. Although, the sort of real world intruding on the film is that Paulette Goddard became Chaplin's lover and common law spouse. So, that's sort of complicating things too, as well, in terms of how we read the film. So enjoy watching Modern Times. I think, really kind of the apex of Chaplin's comedic genius. And we will talk about it together in class. Bye.